Okay, today I will be talking about corn subsidies. Hopefully you all won't already know this. And I'll be using a PowerPoint that I made to give a presentation. Now I'm going to cut this down a lot, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I can talk about this subject for great lengths of time, because it's one of the subjects I'm most passionate about. But this presentation was about 15 minutes, so I'm cutting it down to hopefully be around 3 minutes, 4 minutes. So I'm going to get started. So, corn subsidies. Okay, so the problem in a nutshell is that the American government subsidizes corn growth. If you're not familiar with subsidies, I've provided a handy definition. And so to grow a bushel of corn for an American corn farmer, at current market price, requires a $20 loss. So it's a completely unprofitable business model that the government continues to fund, and it doesn't. So new innovations don't take place in the market because they aren't necessary. So things don't get more efficient or better. Either that or the price of corn should increase, which would stop it being used in all of these places where it absolutely shouldn't be used because of the disastrous effects it has that can only be achieved because the price is kept artificially low. Okay, so corn. Corn is America's largest agricultural export. It receives nearly $4 billion to $9 billion in subsidies every single year. America grows enough corn to cover 2 areas the size of New York State, which is an awful lot of corn. It's more than any of our other crops. What's really awful about corn in specific is that it requires large amounts of pesticides to grow, and especially with ethanol, where we do it supposedly to protect the environment, but the use of pesticides in its growth is just awful. Also, corn is genetically modified to grow in close quarters, recently 2 nations have banned use of genetically modified foods, so this may end up hurting America in the global market. As recent as the EU recently just allowed that. So the reasons we subsidize corn are to use it in ethanol, so that we are using less gasoline. We use it in high fructose corn syrup to replace sugar as a sweetener, and we use it to feed cattle and for humans. The reason given by the government to subsidize specifically corn ethanol, and subsidize it the heaviest, is to cut back on pollution and to save gas and such. But the actual production of corn ethanol requires the generation of a whole lot more pollution than just burning a gallon of gasoline would, compared to a gallon of gasoline with the production of corn ethanol. Oil companies get paid to use corn ethanol, so we subsidize the oil companies, and we pay them to use the corn that we paid to grow. And the only reason we do this is because we have a corn surplus, because the government over-subsidized corn, and to save the American economy, what it did was create an artificial demand for corn, because corn really shouldn't be used as an ethanol, because it's really inefficient and it's really, really expensive. Because the reason it saved, or supposedly saved, our economy was that it's our major export. So corn's linked to the global food shortage because sometimes people argue that when we ever use food as a biofuel, that is taking food away from a person that could be eating it. Though the corn used in ethanols is so heavily genetically modified that it probably wouldn't be safe to eat, but still that argument can be made that it contributes to the global food shortage. Corn is less efficient than other types of ethanols, and less efficient than just pure gasoline, and it's more expensive and causes more pollution. I'll probably make a video about algae ethanol and why I think it's the most beautiful thing on the planet. But corn ethanol cannot be shipped normally with gasoline. So this requires the gasoline to be reprocessed, it has to be refined in different ways, and it has to be shipped in special tunnels made specifically so that it can contain the corn ethanol, which adds dramatically to the actual cost of the production of gasoline and distribution of gasoline. And it's ridiculous that we need to do this, because corn ethanol is awful. And we use 14% of all of our corn in ethanol. Okay, so one of the main uses of corn is as high fructose corn syrup, and this has essentially replaced sugar in all of American food products. It's in all of our sodas, and in our snacks, and in everything. So this dates way back to African slave trade, and I don't really have time to go into the history of corn subsidies and all this stuff and high fructose corn syrup, but it was caused by tariffs and embargoes on production of sugar in America and against other sugar-producing nations. But so what happened is so high fructose corn syrup is ever since like essentially the 80s. We've been using high fructose corn syrup and everything. And if you look at it, that was when the huge spike in obesity occurred in America. So essentially, the obesity epidemic that the media likes to talk a lot about is government subsidized. It's a lot cheaper to use high fructose corn syrup than to use sugar in all of our foods and things. So obviously, a company is going to choose to use high fructose corn syrup, it makes junk foods cheaper to produce because junk foods are the ones that use high fructose corn syrup, whereas healthy foods tend not to have that. So they have to use other types of sweeteners and things. So it's essentially subsidizing junk food, and that becomes the only alternative towards either lower income people and things like that. But so high fructose corn syrup, the body doesn't digest it the same way sugar does, and then they've done experiments with rats and shows how awful high fructose corn syrup is compared to sugar, and also high fructose corn syrup increases your chance of getting diabetes. High fructose corn syrup is really, really awful, and we shouldn't be using it, and in actuality, it doesn't taste nearly as good as sugar does, but we use it because the government has been messing around with the economy for 200 years. Beef. Corn is fed to cows instead of grain, which is ridiculous because cows can't digest corn. So what happens is the cows' bodies, this is all they're fed because it's cheap. Because the corn is grown really cheaply, though not actually, because the government just makes it seem like it's cheap because they pay for all the costs. That's the only thing that's fed to the cows, and it causes tremendous health defects in the cows. The cows are absolutely sickly, and so they're fed perpetual antibiotics. With every meal they have antibiotics. So the cows are just jacked up on pills, and the cows have so many chemicals that the cow's excrement is actually a low-level biohazard. And so this goes off into our groundwater, and it runs off into our rivers. And because we produce so much beef, and so much excrement is produced from this runs down the river, it goes into the Gulf of Mexico. It produced this huge space in the Gulf of Mexico where absolutely nothing can live because the water is so toxic thanks to this cow excrement, and thanks to some other pollutions in a few other rivers, but a large portion of it is due to the cows. Also, all this corn could be used to go to feed people, but it doesn't, and the only reason that we do this instead of using grain is because corn has been subsidized, whereas grain hasn't, so it appears to be cheaper to use corn, when in actuality it costs more, and it's worse for the environment, and it's worse for the people. The destruction of the Amazon rainforest. This seems really distant, and it was completely unexpected, but this is just what happens when the government gets involved in the economy. It causes global issues for things that are seemingly insignificant. What happened was, America was the world's largest soy exporter, but when the government started heavily subsidizing corn, everybody that was making soy decided to jump on the corn bandwagon, since the government would give them more money if they made corn than if they made soy. So, there was not enough soy in the world, the global demand for soy increased, the price of soy went up. So, Brazilian farmers saw this new market for soy, and they wanted to be part of it. So, what they started doing is they started clearing the Amazon rainforest for soy space. And either that would happen, or landowners that would rent the land to cattle herders would realize that they could charge a higher rent for soy farmers, so they'd evict their cattle herders, sell the land to sell the land to soy farmers, and then the cattle herders would have to move into the Amazon rainforest for space, and then they would slash and burn and raise their cattle there, and that is the end of my presentation.